Hello, this is укрлайф TV, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And today we have a special guest. It is Ambassador William Taylor, and he is a Vice President for Europe and Russia in the United States Institute for Peace. He was American ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 till 2009. Ambassador Taylor is graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. Mr. Ambassador, hello, and thank you very much to be with us today.
Lyudmila, it's great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, the war has lasted a year and a half, and it is a good occasion to make some conclusions. And let me start from the very simple question, where we are today, where Ukraine is today, where Russia is today, where America and our Western allies are today, and where are the countries of Global South. It is a very interesting situation as well happened here.
A good question, Lyudmila.
Yeah, a small one.
Very good. Well, let me start with where I think Ukraine is. So I was in Kiev 2 weeks ago. Had an opportunity again, which I really enjoy and appreciate and value, to talk to Ukrainians, talk to people living in Kiev, talk to soldiers, talk to civilians, talk to non-governmental organizations, civil society, talk to ministers and talk to people in the government. And my sense after a year and a half is Ukraine is as determined as ever, maybe even more determined than ever to win this war. And the soldiers I talked to were just back from the front line. One man had gotten permission from his commander to come back and have a meeting with me and some of my colleagues, and he described hard fighting. He described the minefields that he and his colleagues are having to negotiate, navigate, and try to demine, defuse dense minefields. So he was describing the difficulties, but he's absolutely committed to winning the war. He says his mates, his colleagues, his other service members are also committed, and this applies, Lyudmila, to the civil society, people that I talk to, not in the government, people that are focused on living their lives, but living their lives not under Russia, living their lives as a free nation. And that's what they are fighting for. That's what what my impression was. You live there, of course. You see this every day, but it was heartening for me and my colleagues to be able to see that level of determination, commitment, courage on the part of Ukrainians. You asked about the United States and other allies. We are with you. We are in awe of your commitment, of your bravery, of your accomplishments in these 18 months. You have demonstrated to the world that Ukraine can defend itself, is a real nation. It is proving to the world, proving to President Putin that Ukrainian nation is a strong, real entity that is not going away, that is never going away, that it is. We know that the Ukrainian nation has been around longer than the Russians, and it is very clear to us, the United States, but also to Europeans and the rest of the world, that the bravery and the commitment of the Ukrainians is lasting, and that's why we support. That's why we will continue to support. I am very sure that the American people will continue to support Ukraine's fight against Russia. I am very sure that that the support, the military assistance, economic assistance, financial assistance, humanitarian assistance will continue. It is supported in Washington, D.C., where I am. I make speeches and have conversations in other parts of the United States, and I am always encouraged by the support that the American people show for Ukraine. So I think that's there. We can talk about that because it's a political time. It starts to be a political year. Next year we have an election. But I am convinced that the American people will continue to support Ukraine. Lyudmila, you also asked about other nations around the world. And we all watched with great interest the meeting in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, where some 42 nations, many of them from Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia, other parts of the world, came together and listened to the Ukrainian delegation describe President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. That was the reason they came. That was the reason they were invited. That was the rationale that Ukraine had for asking Saudi Arabia to host that meeting. And Saudi Arabia invited people, including the Chinese, who came. The Chinese didn't come to the previous meeting. But they came this time, and they were apparently positive in their interaction with Ukrainians and with others. So that demonstrates to me that there is a diplomatic counteroffensive to go along with the military counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are mounting. And that discussion, that conversation, that conference in Jeddah demonstrated the success of that diplomatic counteroffensive. So those are my sense, Lyudmila, on kind of where Ukraine is on my recent visit, where the United States is, where the rest of the world is. The Russians are increasingly isolated. The Russians are increasingly fragile. And we see, since you and I last talked, we've seen the Prigozhin episode. And that has rattled the Russian elite. That has interjected a sense of uncertainty, of doubt, of suspicion into the Russian chain of command. That can't help their military operation. So the Ukrainian military is determined. The Russian military is fractured, and I think this bodes well for Ukraine's victory.
What is Russia preparing for right now? For continue of the war, to frozen this war, to escalating the war? What do you think? How it's look like from your point of view?
From my point of view, I don't know what they can do in the short term. It's not clear to me that they have any reserves, military reserves that they can put into the battle, into the fight, send into Ukraine. They, of course, we know that there are some 140 million Russians, and there are ways that President Putin can draft more Russian soldiers. It takes time. Russian people don't seem to be particularly interested in being drafted. Many of them leave the country every time there's a new draft. But nonetheless, over time, there's no doubt that the Russian pool of recruits is large. And there's no doubt that they can do that. But right now, they are stretched. The military is stretched. And so they are having a hard time defending against this whole line of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So I don't see an escalation, Lyudmila. I don't see how in the short term they are able to escalate this fight.
Mr. Ambassador, we spoke to you before the Ukrainian offensive began, and in that case, I have two questions. First is, what do you think about the situation around the Ukrainian offensive? What I mean, how you and your colleagues see the situation on the battlefield, because we know that there were many expectations that this offensive will be fast, will be, like blitzkrieg and other expectations. Right now, we understand that it is not blitzkrieg. It is very complicated and hard situation on the battlefield, and that is why. What do you think about all this situation around the counteroffensive? Because I know that many Americans, newspapers and journalists write about this counteroffensive, and this information is very contradictional sometimes because we read it here in Kyiv.
So the counteroffensive is hard. You're exactly right, Lyudmila. It is very hard. Again, when I talk to my friends who are in the Ukrainian army, I have a very good friend, a lieutenant, who was on the front line. I heard from him just yesterday. He was talking about how hot it is on the front line. It's very hard. The Russians have had a lot of time to dig in and to prepare these minefields that he was telling me about. Preparing the obstacles, the trenches, up and down the line. So yes, Americans, like Ukrainians, want Ukraine to win. We also recognize that how Ukraine wins is a Ukrainian decision. That is, this counteroffensive, when and where to attack, when to deploy these units, when to attack in this particular place. Those are not decisions that any foreigner can make. Those are decisions that Ukrainians, generals and leaders are making. And we in the United States, we foreigners need to have patience. We need to be able to continue to provide the support that Ukraine needs. We need to continue to provide the weapons. We need to accelerate the delivery of weapons like the F-16s, which will help, whether it's on this counteroffensive or the next one. Those sophisticated weapons from the United States and NATO will help. And we need to continue to provide them. But the counteroffensive is being led by Ukrainian government, military officials, and we need to support them and be patient as this comes. We need to continue to provide the weapons that these generals and the Ukrainian leadership needs, but we need to be patient and not make demands. I mean, it's inappropriate, totally inappropriate for foreigners to second guess or to express impatience with the pace of the counteroffensive. The counteroffensive is a Ukrainian operation. Ukrainians are making the decisions. Ukrainians are paying the price, all too high a price. We just need to continue to provide the support.
Mr. Ambassador, I remember that in our last interview, we discussed the possible scenario of this war. And I remember that you say that a quick breakthrough offensive is the key to a quick end of the war. What would you say today?
I would say the same thing, Lyudmila. That is, if the Russians crack, if the Russian military is fragile, as I think it is, if the Russian chain of command is focused not on the battlefield in Ukraine, but the Russian chain of command is focused more on Kremlin intrigue and worry about who's loyal to Putin and who's not, what generals are removed because of suspicion or not. what the deal is with Prigozhin and some of these other organizations, military organizations. It's the number of Russian military organizations, some private, some Ministry of Defense, some Ministry of Interior, some National Guard. The number of these Russian military formations is growing. So that's the focus of the Russians. So, in answer to your question, if the Russians are focused on themselves, and the Russians are focused on their chain of command, then the tactics, the strategy that the Ukrainians are using, that is to probe carefully the line, the 600-mile, 900-kilometer front line. That's a good strategy. The Ukrainians can look to see where the Russians are weak. And the Ukrainians can look to try to create weakness in various places. I point out to people that the Russians have to defend and be successful at defending against all 900 kilometers of that front line, whereas Ukrainians only need to be successful in one place. They can pick the place. They don't have to go, the Ukrainians don't have to fight along that whole 900 kilometers. No, the Russians do. The Russians have to be prepared against that, every kilometer of those 900, but the Russians have to spread their forces along that 900, whereas the Ukrainians can concentrate in one place. And they haven't chosen, as near as I can tell, the Ukrainian generals have not decided where to focus. They've got some activities going on right now, of course, that we're watching. But that strength, that ability to focus forces and concentrate forces, that's a Ukrainian advantage. And so if the Russians are fragile, and if the Ukrainians can concentrate, then it is still possible to break through. No one is demanding, expecting any immediate breakthroughs. If it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, the Ukrainians will continue to attrit, continue to kill Russian soldiers everywhere along that line. And as the foreign minister told us in May, when I was there in May, said, this is not the last battle. This is not the last battle. We Ukrainians will continue to fight this battle until we win. And that's what we are all hoping for. We are all counting on. That's what we are sure that in the end, after the last battle, the Ukrainians will win.
Mr. Ambassador, military strategy cannot be and should not be separated from political strategy. And do you see this connection when we speak about the policy of American government? It is very interesting and important for Ukrainians because we remember the words of General Zaluzhny in his last interview for Washington Post when he says that General Milley is understand everything very good, but he is not a person who make a decision. Why ask about that? Because we need more weapons, and you know about that. We need, F-16 and many other things. You know better than me about that. What do you think? What will be the strategy of American government in that case? Can we expect it that it will be more support? That we could receive F-16, for example, and others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am absolutely convinced that the F-16s from the United States and from our allies will come starting this fall. As we know, the training starts this month, the training of pilots. So they've already identified, 16 Ukrainian pilots that have very good English, so they can start that training right away. There's some other training that begins also this month. both in English and on the F-16s. The other thing, of course, that has to happen is all of the logistics and all of the mechanics that service these aircraft have to be trained. So that's all coming, and that will add that capability. Those fighter aircraft will add a real capability to the Ukrainian military. And so whether or not they are in time, the F-16s arrive in time for this counteroffensive, they will be there for the next counteroffensive. They'll be there for the fall and in the winter. And Ukrainians' military support, military capability, augmented, enhanced by these F-16s, also enhanced by the arrival of the American tanks, the Abrams tanks. So yes, the United States is committed to providing more and more of these sophisticated weapons right away, but also, Lyudmila, over time. I mean, I was encouraged by, I hope Ukrainians were encouraged by, as well by the G7 comments and Vilnius, when the G7 countries committed on a collective basis, but on a bilateral agreement basis with Ukrainians to provide Ukraine with the ability to deter and defend itself from Russia. And that was a long-term commitment. So in addition to the F-16s and the tanks and the Abrams tanks and the other weapons and ammunition that's coming right now, in addition to that, there is a commitment for the Americans and the other G7 to provide Ukraine with what it needs in terms of sophisticated weapons and other kind of support, intelligence, training, all of this kind of support that is necessary to defend Ukraine against another Russian invasion. So that is both the short-term and the long-term commitment by the United States, and I am convinced it will continue.
Mr. Ambassador, what do you think will be with the law about Lend-lease? Because we know that the period of Lend-lease must finish in September. And what do you think, how it will continue, or it will be closed? I don't know.
So Lend-lease is very interesting, Lyudmila. I've asked this question as well. And I've asked this question of my friends in the Pentagon and in the National Security Council. And Lend-lease requires repayment, whereas the current drawdowns of weapons under the existing process, the existing procedures, do not require repayment. So yes, Lend-lease is a last resort, or is a second choice. The first choice is to do what we've been doing right now. That is, the Americans have been drawing weapons, ammunition out of our own stockpiles and providing them free to Ukraine without requiring any kind of repayment. Now, if we run out of the financial authority, the legal authority, the appropriation, if we run out of room under this appropriation from the Congress of the budget authority, then we could use Lend-lease. But Lend-lease is second choice. First choice is what we're doing right now, and we have additional funds under the existing authority to draw down, which Ukraine does not have to pay back, and the administration is apparently preparing to ask Congress for an additional $10 billion in authority, which would allow it to continue to provide this kind of assistance to Ukraine without repayment. So Lend-lease is there, but a much better way is the way right now that we are using, that the Pentagon is using to provide Ukraine with the weapons right now that Ukraine does not have to pay back.
Do you think that this Lend-lease will be continue after the September? Because
it could be. I don't know. I don't know. It could be. I know that it is popular in the Congress, and I think the administration would be happy to have it extended. again, it's a good fallback. It's a good second choice. It's a good thing to have in reserve. The best way to provide Ukraine with the weapons right now is through this presidential drawdown authority, as well as this Ukraine Security Initiative, which allocates funds to U.S. Manufacturers to manufacture more weapons for Ukraine. So that's going on right now, and neither of those needs to be repaid. Both of those we are doing because we want Ukraine to win. We want Ukraine to succeed in driving the Russians out of Ukraine. That is the goal, to reestablish territorial integrity, reestablish the sovereignty of Ukraine, which is good for Ukraine, of course, but it's also good for Europe and it's good for the United States.
Mr. Ambassador, it is very interesting story about Prigozhin and Wagner Group, which is now located in Belarus. Do you think that Mr. Lukashenko prepare for his new role? I mean, for example, escalation on the borders with NATO countries. What I mean, I say about escalation on the borders with Poland, with Baltic country, because I know that the leaders and people in that country worried very much about this Wagner group who is sitting in Belarus. And what do you think? What is the scenario could be? Why is this group, sitting in Belarus? And do you expect that it is some special scenario on destabilization, which is preparing by Russia?
Lyudmila, you know Belarus better than I, certainly. All Ukrainians know their neighbors much better than Americans or foreigners. But my impression is a couple of things. One is Putin and the defense ministry in the Kremlin in Moscow, they're not sure they can trust Prigozhin. They're not sure they can trust Wagner. They wanted them out of the country. They wanted Wagner to be exiled into Belarus, where he would be Lukashenko's problem. I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that Wagner poses a threat either to Poland or to Ukraine, for that matter. If Lukashenko were to allow the Wagner group to attack into Poland, attack into a NATO nation, that would be suicide. That would be suicide for Belarus and probably for Russia. If he were to allow the Wagner group to start an attack on a NATO nation, that would be crazy. And I also think Lukashenko would have big problems if he were to allow Wagner to attack into Ukraine. Again, Lyudmila, you know the Belarusian people better than I do, but my impression is the Belarusians are not interested in fighting Ukraine. The Belarusian people, many Belarusians are supportive of Ukraine. There are many, when I was in Kyiv in May, I met with some soldiers from the front line. They were back on a brief relaxation, recovery, and two of them were from Belarus. Two of them actually were Americans, I will tell you, and then there were three of them. Of course, they're Ukrainians. But there are Belarusians who are in Ukraine fighting against the Russians. They're fighting on the side of the Ukrainians. So I don't see Lukashenko allowing the Wagner group to be a threat either to Poland or to Ukraine.
Mr. Ambassador, now we see that the leaders of many countries are ready to be involved in process of negotiation about the end of the war in Ukraine. It is very interesting that it is the leaders of China, Africa, Latin America, and Middle East and others. Why do you think this process is so popular among so many leaders? Does they think that this negotiation could be very, successful and gives them, I don't know, special weight in, global world? Or what's happened? Why it is so popular to speak?
It's a very good question. So I think a couple things, Lyudmila, that explain this. One is Russia's war is having a negative effect, is having a detrimental effect, is harming nations around the world. Russia's war is raising food prices. Russia's war is raising energy prices. Russia's war is destabilizing around the world. So nations, leaders around the world want to try to stop this Russian war. So that's number one. Number two, there are some national leaders, maybe in Saudi Arabia, maybe in China, maybe in India, maybe in Brazil, who would like to establish themselves as statesmen, as peace builders, as peacemakers. Some of these that's all positive, and we saw them assemble there and get together in Jeddah last weekend, and they were there to listen to the Ukrainian delegation describe President Zelensky's 10-point plan, which was the purpose of that meeting, is to consider and talk about, discuss, make recommendations, maybe adjust the different points of the 10-point plan. But the 10-point plan is the basis, is the beginning. Other nations, the Chinese have a proposal, a 12-point plan. No one thinks that the Chinese, I don't think there's anyone, but maybe the Chinese, think that they can be the leaders of this negotiation. No, the Chinese are too associated with the Russians. The Chinese, by the way, Lyudmila, I think they recognize that they are too associated with the Russians. They seem to be trying to move away a little bit from the Russians. Just by showing up in Jeddah, the Chinese have sent a signal to the world, to the Ukrainians and to the Russians that says, we're not on the Russian side. We may, be rhetorically supportive of the Russians, but we, in fact, I think the foreign minister, the lead diplomat, said that they're independent, that they're impartial. The Chinese are impartial, neutral on this thing. Well, that's good as long as they continue that neutrality and don't provide weapons to the Russians. That's a good thing. But if they think they can, drive the negotiation process, I think that's probably not going to happen. Nor do I think the Indians or the Brazilians or even the Saudis are going to do that. That's going to be up to the Ukrainians to decide when to negotiate. And President Zelensky's been very clear, and the United States supports this. That is, negotiations will come. The United States supports Ukraine deciding when to negotiate, and we support President Zelensky's decision not to negotiate until the Russians are out of Ukraine. When the Russians are out of Ukraine, then that's time to sit down and talk about reparations. Sit down and talk about accountability. Sit down and talk about reestablishing the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, accountability. Those are going to be key for negotiation once the Russians are out of Ukraine. And so I think the lead on this Ukrainian 10-point plan is clearly President Zelensky, and the lead on establishing that negotiation is going to be Ukraine. And we support that.
Mr. Ambassador, let's look for the situation from the global point of view. Maybe a year ago, it seems that Putin tried to use this problem between Western country and countries of globalists, and it looks like that Putin tried to lead these countries against the West. And in that case, many say that countries of Global South is not support Ukraine because they are against some Western policy. But what do you think, what happens right now? Do you think that Western diplomacy and Western leaders try to create more communication with leaders of countries of Global South, try to decline these problems, try to find some understanding in different sphere where it is possible, maybe economy, maybe, I don't know, military, maybe policy, some what do you think? What happened in global thing? Because many people say that, that the time of globalization is finished and now we will see separate camps and it will be problem for global situation. What do you think? What happened?
So I think that the nations of the world have observed over the past 18 months what's going on in Ukraine, and they see Russia as the aggressor. And there's no doubt. I mean, there's no doubt that Russia has violated international law, has violated the principles of the UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter that all nations have signed up to, which again, at its core, the Charter has sovereignty and territorial integrity. So these concepts, these principles, it's very clear over the past 18 months that the Russians are violating these principles, number one. Number two, the United States and others, Europeans, Ukrainians, have made the point that if Russia is allowed to break these rules, to violate these principles, to invade a neighbor, a smaller neighbor, and get away with it, and grab territory and get away with it, and kill civilians and get away with it, and perpetrate atrocities, war crimes, and get away with it, to pursue genocide and get away with it, then no one is secure. No one is secure. Nations around the world want to be confident that their borders are their borders. Nations around the world want to be sure that their neighbors won't invade them. And if Russia gets away with violating borders, of violating sovereignty, of committing war crimes and atrocities, and genocide, and getting away with it, then no one is secure. And the nations of the world are recognizing this. We see this, Lyudmila, in the votes in the General Assembly. It's been overwhelming, the support for Ukraine. 140-5 is the usual one. Now there are some 35 abstentions, but even those abstentions, the Chinese don't support the Russians in those votes. The Indians don't support the Russians in those votes. The South Africans don't support the Russians in those votes. No, the Russians get 5 votes. They get the votes of North Korea and Belarus, maybe Syria. So they get the outlaws. So the overwhelming consensus in the world, in the United Nations, and in the view of the world is that the Russians are the aggressor. They need to be stopped. If they get away with it, then no one is secure. I think that message is coming through.
Mr. Ambassador, a couple of days ago, Mr. Yermak says that Ukraine starts the negotiation with United States about the security guarantees. What does it mean for Ukraine, and how you understand what will be this process and how this security guarantee could look like?
Exactly. I was very glad that the United States was the first of the G7 nations to make good on that commitment. I mean, again, we talked about the G7 statement coming out of Vilnius, where the G7 said that we were all going to negotiate bilateral agreements with the Ukrainians to provide long-term assurances and commitments to Ukrainian security and sovereignty and territorial integrity. And the Americans have started that. You know, the U.S. government started that with Mr. Yermak a couple of days ago, which is a good sign. I'm glad that we started off, and I'm sure the other G7 nations will follow and make good on that. And what is it? That is a commitment to the long-term security of Ukraine. We are committed, as we've talked about, Lyudmila, to the short-term security as well. Short-term, we need to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to prevail against the Russians right now, over the next month, over the next 6 months, over the next year. We want to be sure that the Ukrainians can push the Russians out of their country in the short term. But we also want to be sure that Ukraine is secure for the long term. Now, Ukraine is always going to have a threat. Ukraine can never get out of the neighborhood. Russia is always going to be a neighbor. That's a problem. And it's a problem as long as the Russians have this imperial instinct. As long as the Russians think that they are deserving of empire, as long as the Russians continue to think that they can dominate their neighbors, then Ukraine and all other neighbors around Russia's borders are vulnerable, are in jeopardy, are in danger. And so until the Russians give up empire, until they eliminate this imperial instinct, until that happens, the G7, led by the United States, is going to provide Ukraine with the means to defend itself. And the means what that means is sophisticated weapons. And the commitment for the long-term commitment, long-term provision of those sophisticated weapons. And so there is a short-term commitment to see Ukraine win right now and push the Russians out. But there's a long-term commitment to be sure that as long as that imperial instinct on the part of the Russians, which threatens all of Russian neighbors, as long as that's there, that will support Ukrainian sovereignty and independence.
If you say about the long-term guarantees, doesn't mean that NATO membership is under the question.
No. Very good question. Very good question. Vilnius, I think, was a good sign for Ukrainians' NATO membership. Vilnius took NATO membership for Ukraine very, very seriously. The debate leading up to Vilnius was encouraging, in my view. Many European nations, maybe even most European nations, were willing to offer Ukraine an invitation to join NATO once the war's over, after the victory. It's too bad that the Americans and the Germans did not agree. It's too bad that the Americans and Germans were not willing to give that invitation yet, but that will come. And Vilnius did say, Vilnius took NATO membership for Ukraine very seriously, and I am sure that exactly what the leaders said in Vilnius, that is, Ukraine's future is in NATO. There's no doubt about that. After the victory, Ukraine will join NATO, just like Finland, just like Sweden. After the victory, Ukraine will be a net contributor, will be a strong contributor of security to the NATO alliance. So I am absolutely sure that Ukraine's future is in NATO, and that these security guarantees, security assurances, security commitments that the G7 talked about are in the meantime, in the interim, until so these commitments are there until Ukraine joins NATO. When Ukraine joins NATO, that's the security guarantee. That's the best security guarantee. Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the best security guarantee that Ukraine can have, and that's coming. But in the meantime, In the meantime, the G7 and the NATO nations are providing both short-term and long-term assurances, commitments to Ukraine's security. So in the meantime, it will be secure. Ukraine will win this war, and then will be secure from another invasion by the Russians, and then Ukraine will join NATO.
Mr. Ambassador, about the last argument which Russia likes to use, Mr. Medvedev, who was the president of Russia, says that if Ukrainian counteroffensive will be successful, we will use nuclear weapons. And it's like a last argument. Does America and our Western partners are ready for such nuclear threat, and does America is ready to answer for this last argument from Russia? Because nuclear weapon, this is the end.
Lyudmila, first of all, I don't know anyone who takes Mr. Medvedev seriously. I don't know anyone who takes him seriously. I mean, he's like a barking dog,
Yeah.
So no one takes him seriously. No, that's number one. Number two, has told the Russians that if they do something so stupid, if they make such a blunder and use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, that the Russians will face catastrophic consequences. We've made that public. We've made it clear in private. The Russians know it. If they were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, catastrophic consequences means incredible damage to Russian military, from NATO military and from the United States military. Conventional, there would not be a nuclear response, I don't think, but there would be catastrophic consequences for the Russian military, whether it's the Russian Navy, Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Army, the Russian Air Force, catastrophic consequences. And that is deterrence. And that is what's kept people from, that has meant no one uses nuclear weapons ever, and certainly hasn't since 1945. So that will continue. That is deterrence. Catastrophic consequences is what would happen if the Russians would do it. But no one takes Medvedev seriously.
Mr. Ambassador, last question. During our last interview, I asked you, do you think that this war will be a long war? And you say that no, you don't think so. It was on your last interview. If I ask you again, do you think that it will be a long war? What will be your answer today?
My answer would probably be the same. That is, it's possible that this war could end this year. It is possible. Again, if the Russian military is as in bad a shape as I think it is, and if the Ukrainians get the weapons, the F-16s, the ATACMS, long-range missiles from the United States and from the rest of NATO, it is possible for Ukraine to win this war this year with our support. So that's possible. It's also possible that this war drags out. This war could drag out. Ukraine, I am convinced, and Ukrainians tell me, you've told me, and I've heard from soldiers, I've heard from civilians, I've heard from civil society. Ukraine will not stop fighting for its independence, for its freedom. Ukrainians don't want to live under Russia, and they will continue to fight until they are free from that. So, and that could be long. That could be long. That could take a long time. The West will support Ukraine in that, and will try to shorten the war. And it is possible that the war could be short, but it's possible it could drag out. And in that scenario, we should provide Ukrainians with all the support they need to continue to develop and take care of themselves while they try to get the Russians out of their country.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much to be with us today. Thank you.
Lyudmila, thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.